Hello everyone, I am the Medic Kirby, and welcome to my channel, The Commander Tavern. The Commander Tavern is a channel dedicated to my favorite Magic Gathering format. The Brewery is a series on this channel showcasing my spicy brews or the deck techs. On this episode of The Brewery, I'll be discussing my take on a commander from Baldur's Gate, Raggadragga Goreguts boss. If you like this deck or any of the cards I'll be mentioning throughout the video, please consider using my TCG Player affiliate link when purchasing those cards. You can find that link down in the description. It'll really help out the channel. The best way you can help support the channel is with my Patreon. For just $1, patrons get early access to certain videos on YouTube. In fact, patrons get a chance to see this video earlier. You can also support my channel for free by simply liking, subscribing, and sharing, which also helps out a lot. I put out a video every Monday, so you don't want to miss out. You can join my Discord server for free if you want to join the Commander Tavern community. All pertinent links are down in the description. Alright, let's get back to the episode. Raggadragga is a 4/4 human board for 2 generic, 1 red, and 1 green. It has 2 abilities that care about mana dorks. The first one, a static ability, pumps all of your mana dorks +2/+2. Its second one, a triggered ability, untaps a mana dork whenever it attacks. So naturally, you're going to want to add a ton of cheap mana dorks in this deck. That being said, there are 2 key rules about this deck that we want to make the most of, which I'll discuss in a bit. Thanks to these rules, what you consider to be a mana dork might be only the tip of the iceberg of possibilities. Raggadragga interacts with way more cards than you might expect. As if that weren't enough, it also has a triggered ability that happens when you spend at least 7 mana to cast a spell. When you do, you untap a creature and it gets +7/+7 until end of turn. This is nothing to scoff at if we're going as aggressive as possible with the deck. Now, as I just mentioned, there are 2 rules that are super important to keep in mind when building a Raggadragga deck. CR 605.1a and CR 605.1b. The first one says an activated ability is a mana ability if it meets all of the following criteria. It doesn't require a target, it could add mana to a player's mana pool when it resolves, and it's not a loyalty ability. This means that any creature with an activated ability that meets this rule will interact with Raggadragga. These are your typical tap to add mana dorks. This means that creatures like Treasonous Ogre will also work with Raggadragga. Not only that, but tokens too. Specifically, Eldrazi Spawn and Eldrazi Scion tokens. This interaction is insane. There are so many ways to create bunches of these at once, and then Raggadragga gives them +2/+2. The amount of power you can amass on the board with such a small investment of mana is ridiculous. The second one says, a triggered ability is a mana ability if it meets all the following criteria. It doesn't require a target, it triggers from the activation or resolution of an activated mana ability, or from mana being added to a player's mana pool, and it could add mana to a player's mana pool when it resolves. Rapacious One, Spawnsire of Ulamog, and Skittering Invasion each make Eldrazi Scion tokens. Granted, some of these are a bit hefty to cast, but the latter 2 are great for triggering Raggadragga's third ability. Rapacious One is super busted here. Unfortunately, it doesn't interact with Raggadragga itself, but the deck has other ways to pump creatures. Once it does connect, the amount of Eldrazi Scions you will create is going to easily overtake the board, considering that Raggadragga makes those tokens 2/3 instead. Spawnsire can pop out 2 2/3s for 4 generic, which is great because it's essentially 4 power for 4 mana. Oh, and it's also a 7/11 with Annihilator 1 if that wasn't enough. Skittering Invasion is even more ridiculous. For 7 mana, you get to put 10 power on the board that you can then sacrifice for colorless mana in a pinch. These Eldrazi tokens are super clutch in a Raggadragga deck. Vow Redeemer also creates Eldrazi tokens, but they're 1/1 Scions, which is just slightly better. However, this one is used more as interaction than anything. When cast right after a board wipe we couldn't prevent, we'll create an Eldrazi Scion for each of our non-token creatures that died because of it. Then, when we get Raggadragga again, all of those 1/1s will be 3/3s and hopefully no one else will have creatures on the board. However, the best mana dorks for that are the Man Lands in the deck. Lair of the Hydra, Blinkmoth Nexus, Inkmoth Nexus, Mutavault, and Mishra's Factory. If you're worried about board wipes, don't worry. They'd have to be instant speed board wipes if we're animating these on our turn. Not only do these not take up a slot in the deck, but are absolutely busted with Raggadragga. Once you animate them for just 1 mana, by the way, except the Hydra, but at least you can make it as big as you want, they will be a creature with a mana ability, meaning that they'll be +2/+2 bigger than what they normally would be. So good, especially with Inkmoth Nexus having Flying and Infect. This alone can potentially take out a player in a couple of turns, or even 1 turn with the rest of the pump effects in the deck. In fact, Animating Lance is one of the deck's main gimmicks. Nissa Vital Force can animate any of our lands, making it a 5/5 on her own, but a 7/7 with Raggadragga out. Oh, and it has haste too. This also lasts until our next turn. So we can swing with it, have it untap on attacking, so it stays untapped to block until our next turn. Nissa's other abilities are also relevant, with her -3 being a recovery effect and her ultimate being an emblem that is absolutely busted. The deck has fetch lands and land-based ramp, so we can draw cards off of it multiple times throughout a game. Fellow Knight Druid and Nature's Revolt also animate lands. The Druid requires sacrificing a creature, but will always have something for it when necessary. Our lands then become 2/3s until end of turn, but actually 4/5s with Raggadragga out, which is nothing to scoff at. The enchantment statically makes all lands on the battlefield be 2/2s. Not only does this deter board wipes since they'd all become Armageddon effects, but our lands will be twice as large as our opponents thanks to our commander. Kamal's Will is another way to animate our lands, but it's a one-time only deal. If we control Raggadragga, we can choose both options as well as those lands being 3/3s, which is nothing to scoff at. Besides these interesting cards I'm running, it's also worth including some run-of-the-mill mana dorks as well. Birds of Paradise, Llanowar Elves, Finhorn Elves, Elvish Mystic, Boreal Druid, Tangled Florahedron, and Dryad Arbor each tap for 1 mana. The first 5 are free, and while the Florahedron costs 2 to tap for 1, since its backside is a land, it doesn't really take up a slot in the deck. Speaking of lands, Dryad Arbor also doesn't take up a slot in the deck, and since it's a forest, it can be fetched for at instant speed with the fetch land, so you're getting a 3/3 for free. Freyalise, Llanowar's Fury, also creates mana dorks that can tap for 1 mana. While you can just do this indefinitely each turn, her other abilities are also relevant. Her -2 is a naturalize effect, and her ultimate can draw us into an insane amount of cards. She's easily one of the best planeswalkers in the deck. Well, all 3 planeswalkers are amazing, but we'll see the 3rd one soon. Whisperer of the Wilds and Elysian Caryatid are the 2 drops that tap for 2, and Llanowar Tribe is the 3 drop that taps for 3. Well, the first 2 tap for 2 mana if the condition is met, but our commander is enough for that. So far we've seen that I've included mana dorks that tap down for at least what they cost to play. But there's more. Circle of Dreams Druid, Selvala Heart of the Wilds, Karametra's Acolyte, and Nykthos Trying to Nyx tap down for an insane amount of mana. Well, Nykthos is a land and not a creature, but the fact remains that it can tap down for a ton of mana since the deck is mostly green. Same with Karametra's Acolyte, which is like Nykthos on a body. Speaking of, Circle of Dreams Druid is just Gaia's Cradle on a body. Selvala can also tap for a ton of mana, and fortunately in any combination of colors. She can also potentially draw us a card, but be wary since she can also do the same for opponents as well. Heronblade Elite and Viridian Joiner can also potentially tap down for a ton of mana than their casting cost, but their power has to be large enough. That shouldn't be a problem in this deck though, since Raggadragga isn't the only pump effect. Speaking of big mana, Nyxbloom Ancient and Nissa Who Shakes the World aren't mana dorks per se, but they help augment our mana production. The Ancient is absolutely busted in here, and its casting cost isn't any kind of restriction. In fact, Raggadragga loves it because it costs 7 to cast. Nissa makes our forest tap for an additional green. She also has a land reanimating ability similar to the previous Nissa, so that's even more relevant here. Her emblem is also super busted since it makes our lands indestructible. If we're planning on attacking with as many lands as possible, we don't want them to die in combat. If that weren't enough, besides the emblem, we get to fetch for all of the forests in our library straight to the battlefield. I told you all 3 planeswalkers are busted in this deck. Yavimaya Cradle of Growth is included not only because there's no reason not to, but because it makes sure that Nissa counts all of our lands. It also helps our fetch lands and man lands tap for green, since we have the potential of having too many colorless mana sources in the deck. Besides all these mana dorks, Ashaya Soul of the Wild, Cryptolith Rite, and Song of Freyalise make it so that all of our creatures have a mana ability. Ashaya makes our non-token creatures be forests as well, meaning that they'll tap for green. Since it's a static ability, any non-token creature entering the battlefield under our control will also trigger any landfall effects in the deck. So good. The 2 enchantments don't care whether the creatures are tokens or not, which doesn't really matter since all the tokens the deck creates have mana abilities anyways. That being said, it ensures that all of our creatures, including Raggadragga itself, enjoy the benefits. As a bonus, the saga's final chapter is an amazing boon to try and go for that Alpha Strike. Speaking of Alpha Strike, that's the main way the deck aims to win, combat. While a +2/+2 pump might not seem that massive in Commander, it starts to add up when you're casting 1-drops that then become 3/3 the moment they hit the battlefield. Or your man lands are huge for a minimal investment in mana. This is why the deck is also running Akroma's Memorial, Beastmaster Ascension, and Unnatural Growth. The Memorial doesn't grant any increase in power and toughness, but it does give all of our creatures a pretty tasty keyword soup. Oh, and it also costs 7 mana. The enchantments do considerably pump our creatures' power and toughness for a very small investment in mana. These 2 enchantments do a ton of work. Nylea God of the Hunt, Elder of Laurels, and Kessig Wolfrun are some more ways to pump our creatures, but can only do so 1 at a time, which is still fine. Recall that Raggadragga untaps any mana dork that attacked once it attacks, so we can then tap them all down and sink all of our mana into whatever creature wasn't blocked. Oh, and Nylea gives trample to all of our creatures, which is quite good as well. Best of all, since the deck is also red, it can run Hellkite Charger and Aggravated Assault. Since we can untap all of our attacking mana dorks, we can potentially get infinite combat steps thanks to these two permanents. With all of the mana dorks in the deck, we can just tap them down to pay for any of these abilities because they untap all of our creatures once they resolve. With infinite combat steps, we should potentially get the win. However, what if we're facing against those annoying decks that don't let us attack? I got you, fam. Crackle with Power and Jaya's Immolating Inferno. With enough mana, we can take out all three opponents at once with either of these spells. With all of the mana dorks and a mana acceleration in the deck, we can take out our remaining weakened opponents no problem. That being said, we can also bank our mana each turn to help power these easily. Horizon Stone does just that. If it sticks around, we can sink all of our mana at the end of the turn before ours in order to then have all that colorless mana into our mana pool, just accumulating until we want to cast any of these game-ending X spells. But what if we can't win this way? I gotcha, fam. Helix Pinnacle gets the job done. We can sink our mana at the beginning of the end step before ours each turn. Is 100 mana a lot? Yes. Can this deck get there faster than most other decks? Yes. In fact, we don't even need to attack with the previously mentioned infinite combat cards. If we're generating infinite mana, we could just sink them into Helix Pinnacle and then wait until our upkeep. Or just win on the spot with Shaman of Forgotten Ways. Biorhythm might be banned, but not this one. Even if opponents have a handful of creatures, the drop in life will be so significant that, with a small enough band of creatures that are big enough, we can just win via combat damage that same turn or the next one. Oh, best of all, it's also a mana dork, so Raggadragga makes it even bigger and thus less susceptible to dying to damage effects. The following cards in the deck are the essential card advantage, responses, and mana acceleration of any deck. Since the deck is obviously accelerating its mana with all of the mana dorks, it's not running any mana drops, not even Soul Ring. That being said, it's still running Sylvan Scrying, 3 Visits, and Nature's Lore. Sylvan Scrying isn't acceleration per se, since it goes to your hand, but the deck has so many utility lands as well as mana lands that it's definitely worth including. As for card advantage, the deck is running the Great Henge, Beast Whisperer, Primordial Sage, Soul of the Harvest, Guardian Project, and Zendikar Resurgent. Each of these trigger either when we cast a creature spell or a non-token creature enters the battlefield under our control. 36% of the deck is creatures, so these will definitely help us draw through our deck. As a bonus, Zendikar Resurgent is another way to magnify our mana production, and the Great Henge gives a +1/+1 counter to that non-token creature when it enters the battlefield. Oh, and it can tap for mana too. Lifecrafter's Bestiary does something similar, but we have to pay 1 green mana when we cast a creature spell. That's fine since the deck generates so much mana. Being able to draw a card in a pinch for just 1 green is nothing. As a bonus, we also scry one at the beginning of our upkeep. Toski, Bear of Secrets, and Aron Frostfang also draws cards off of triggered effects, but when a creature we control deals combat damage to a player. Considering how aggressive the deck is, these help us draw into a ton of cards. Best of all, the Frostfang also gives our attacking creatures Death Touch, which makes opponents think twice about blocking, especially if what we're sending their way are just mana dorks or Eldrazi tokens. Collective Unconscious, Shamanic Revelation, and Mouth to Feed also draws into a ton of cards since the deck runs a ton of creatures, plus it creates them too. We do have to cast Feed from the graveyard, but since Raggadragga pumps our mana dorks +2/+2, we should have enough 3-powered creatures to draw a ton of cards with it. Regal Force can also draw us a ton of cards when it enters the battlefield since most of our creatures are green. Best of all, it costs 7 mana, which Raggadragga also appreciates. The deck also draws into so many cards that Reliquary Tower is included for good measure. It doesn't take up a slot on the deck, and even though it taps for colorless, that's what Yamavaya is for. Now, as I previously mentioned, the deck isn't running mana rocks, so we can run Collector Oof no problem. Non-green decks absolutely hate this card since the way they accelerate their mana most is via mana rocks, but we want to be the only ones accelerating our mana, so let's nerf their rocks. Or we can just blow them up altogether with Terracodon. This gets rid of any non-creature thrice, which is nothing to scoff at. They do get a 3/3 element for their trouble, but that's nothing in the grander scheme of things. Decimate also helps get rid of multiple targets and is such a great card in red-green decks. No red-green deck should be without Decimate. Same with Chaos Warp and Beast Within. These can deal with absolutely any permanent at instant speed, including lands. These are great against those pesky fog lands as well as the occasional Rogue's Passage against Voltron decks. Warping Whale is another amazing instant in the deck and well worth including considering all of the colorless mana sources in the deck. Not only can we create an Eldrazi token in a pinch, but we can also counter a sorcery spell. Since more board wipes are sorceries, it's a great way to protect our board. Speaking of, Heroic Intervention and Rapid Vigor are obviously included. While there are plenty of ways to make our lands indestructible, our main win con is aggression, so we want our creatures to survive. Being able to deal with board wipes is super important. Granted, Rapid Vigor is moot against board wipes that don't have the can't be regenerated clause, but not all of them do. Shadow Skull Smashing doesn't take up a slot on the deck because its backside is a land, and it's a great way to deal with creatures. Unfortunately, we can only hit at most 2 creatures, but we can sink as much into X as we want since we're generating so much mana. Archetype of Endurance and Vexing Shusher are the final interactive pieces in the deck, but they're more defensive. The archetype giving our creatures hexproof is great even if it does cost 8 mana, which, again, is not only nothing to the deck, but Raggadragga welcomes it. Vexing Shusher is a great way to make sure our previously mentioned game-ending X spells aren't countered, or none of our spells for that matter. Last thing we need is someone countering our Heroic Intervention. The rest of the deck is just the rest of the lands. The deck's running all 7 fetch lands, Stomping Ground, Cinderglade, Sheltered Thicket, Highland Forest, and Ancient Tomb, as well as 8 snow-covered forests and 2 snow-covered mountains. The deck is mostly green, which is why the basics are distributed like this. As with all my deck techs, you can build your mana base according to your budget. Whether you include more expensive cards or even cheaper cards is up to you. You do you. This brew is just an idea of how to build around Raggadragga Goreguts boss. Hopefully you learned about the different types of mana dorks you can include in a Raggadragga deck. Your only limitation is what you can find these satisfying those 2 rules that I explained in the beginning of the video. At least with my deck, I wanted multiple routes to victory, which also makes the deck more fun to play since it's not so linear. If you're interested in the deck list of this spicy brew of mine, you can find a link to it down in the description. I would like to thank all my patrons for supporting me, and a quick shout out to all my higher tier patrons, the brewers, for their patronage. I'd also like to thank anyone using my TCG Player affiliate link. That also helps out the channel. And to everyone, thanks for watching this episode of The Brewery on the Commander Tavern. I'm the Medic Kirby, and happy brewing.